All right, let's be real. Who doesn't love a good fantasy film? But, sometimes it's those epic fails that really get us talking, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So today we're diving into fantasy films, 21st century's worst adaptations and fails. And specifically, we're going to focus on that top 10 worst list.
Ooh, juicy.
Yeah, it is. But, we're not just here to poke fun at these cinematic train wrecks. We're going to try to figure out what makes these failures so fascinating.
Right.
What were the filmmakers going for, and where did it all go so wrong?
It's a tough task adapting fantasy. I mean, think about it. The source material usually comes with like super passionate fans, intricate worlds, and you're not just adapting a plot. You're trying to like capture that magic.
Totally. And when it's missing, the disappointment can be huge.
For sure.
Speaking of passionate fans, let's start with some films that sparked some serious controversy. The Last Airbender and Gods of Egypt both were really slammed for casting choices that felt, well, a little out of touch with the source material.
Yeah. The backlash went beyond just like the actors. It really tapped into this bigger conversation about representation and authenticity in fantasy.
Right.
Fans felt like the cultural context was being erased, which is especially jarring when you're dealing with worlds inspired by, diverse mythologies.
And it wasn't just fans calling this out. Even the director of Gods of Egypt later admitted to, missing the mark with the casting.
Yeah.
Kind of got a sting a little bit, right? But it does show that there's a shift in awareness, which is a step in the right direction.
It certainly does.
Now, on a purely technical level, another pitfall we see in this list is the overuse of CGI.
Oh, yeah.
Gods of Egypt pops up again here alongside Seventh Son.
Yeah.
It's like they thought more CGI equals more epic, but it often had the opposite effect.
Absolutely.
Gods of Egypt especially felt like it leaned so hard on CGI that it almost went into that uncanny valley territory.
Yes.
Where things look almost real, but something just feels off and it's kind of creepy.
That unsettling feeling you get when something looks almost human, but not quite.
Exactly.
Like in Gods of Egypt, think about those stiff facial expressions, the movements. It takes you out of the story instead of drawing you in.
Right.
Remember all the excitement around Saphira, the dragon from Aragon? Everyone was so excited to see this majestic creature on the big screen. And then, well, let's just say the final CGI dragon didn't quite live up to the hype.
It's like they put all their energy into making Saphira technologically impressive, but forgot to give her any soul.
Yeah, it highlights this really important point. Spectacle without substance just leaves you feeling kind of empty.
Speaking of substance, or lack thereof, let's talk about the curse of the rushed adaptation. Aragon and the Dark Tower, oh boy, those are prime examples of trying to cram epic, sprawling narratives into runtimes that just couldn't contain them.
Right, they tried to fit like a whole universe into a tiny box.
Yeah. I remember feeling like I was watching a highlight reel of the Dark Tower instead of like actually experiencing the story.
Yeah.
They hit the major plot points, but all that rich world building, all those characters from the books, just gone.
And that's really where these adaptations miss the mark. They focus so much on like translating the plot that they forgot about the heart of the story. The things that made fans connect with those worlds in the first place.
It's like baking a cake and forgetting the sugar, You've got the ingredients, but it's just not going to taste right.
Perfect analogy. And sometimes even a sprinkle of Hollywood stardust can't save a doomed adaptation.
Right.
Take Seventh Son, for example, with Jeff Bridges, Julianne Moore.
Yeah, you'd think with that star power they could pull off anything, but Seventh Son proves that big names and big budgets just aren't enough if the story itself doesn't hold up.
It's like putting a fancy coat of paint on a crumbling house. You can try to cover up those problems, but they're still there.
Exactly.
And speaking of questionable casting, we can't forget Jeremy Irons, who somehow ended up in two of these top 10 worst films, Dungeons & Dragons from 2000 and Aragon.
His performance in Dungeons & Dragons is kind of legendary, though maybe not for the reasons he intended. It's so over the top that it almost becomes, like, enjoyable in its own way.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's that so bad it's good phenomena.
Exactly. Have you seen it? What did you think?
I have, and honestly, I'm still not sure what to make of it. It's like a car crash you can't look away from.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique experience. But hey, let's get into some specific examples of what really went wrong in these films. You're a big fan of the Last Airbender series.
Oh, huge fan.
So we have to talk about that infamous earthbending scene.
Oh, no.
Imagine, instead of the swift, powerful movements from the animated series, we get this group of earthbenders awkwardly shuffling their feet and waving their arms. It feels like forever before a single rock moves, like a couple of inches.
It's painful to watch. They
Yeah.
completely miss the point of bending. In the show, it's not just physical, it's a spiritual connection to the element.
Right.
The film just turned this display of power and grace into something clunky and awkward.
All right, let's switch to Aragon for a sec. Remember the difference between Jeremy Irons, all dramatic as Brahm, and Ed Speller's, let's say, reserved performance as Aragon? It felt like they were acting in two completely different movies.
Yeah, the uneven acting is a symptom of a bigger problem. There's no chemistry, and the direction feels unclear. The actors just seem lost, unsure of how to play their roles or how to interact with each other.
Okay, ready for this. Let's go back to Dungeons and Dragons and that legendary Jeremy Irons shouting scene.
Oh boy.
Picture him standing there, full villain gear, bellowing lines like a Shakespearean actor who wandered onto the wrong set.
Right.
It's so over the top, it's almost impressive.
You have to admire the commitment, I guess.
It does make you wonder, can a movie so bad it's good actually be considered a successful adaptation? I'm curious, what do you think?
That's a tough one. I mean, it depends on how you define successful, right?
True.
Does it have to be critically acclaimed, or can it find a different kind of success, like becoming a cult classic that people enjoy because it's so ridiculous?
Maybe we need a whole new category for those so bad they're good adaptations.
I'm on board with that.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's move on to The Legend of Hercules.
Ah, yes. A film that promised epic battles and mythical grandeur, but delivered something else.
Totally. Picture a climactic fight scene with a lightning whip. It should have been thrilling, visually stunning, but it ends up looking like, I don't know, a poorly choreographed school play. The movements are awkward. The special effects feel straight out of a 90s video game.
It's like they didn't even believe in the myth they were trying to portray.
It's like trying to create a lightning bolt and all you get is a flicker.
A very dim flicker.
Let's shift gears a bit. How about The Snow Queen? It aimed for that classic fairy tale magic, but the animation felt, well, a little frozen in time, especially compared to Disney's Frozen, which ironically is kind of inspired by the same fairy tale.
It's amazing how much technology has changed animation.
Right.
The Snow Queen just couldn't compete with the visuals that audiences have come to expect.
Okay, gotta mention the Nutcracker and the Four Realms. Keira Knightley, amazing actress, but her performance as the Sugar Plum Fairy was
Oh, yes.
a lot, let's just say that.
It was a choice, that's for sure.
And finally, Artemis Fowl. This film felt like it was trying so hard to be clever and edgy that it forgot to be, well, entertaining. Remember that part where Josh Gad's character, Mulch Diggums, talks directly to the camera?
Oh, the exposition dumps.
It was like they were trying to force-feed the audience information that they cut from the main story.
A classic example of how too much exposition can actually hurt the story.
So we've seen a lot of what went wrong, but beyond just laughing at these flops, what can we actually learn? What can these films teach us about the challenges of adapting fantasy and, the complexities of filmmaking in general?
It's all about approaching adaptation with respect for the source material, a deep understanding of the genre, and trust in the audience.
They're remembering that adaptation is this delicate balancing act. You want to stay true to the original, but also create something new.
Right, you have to walk that tightrope between being faithful and being original.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's kind of funny we're talking about failures,
Yeah.
but dissecting these films, figuring out what went wrong, it's actually really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a puzzle trying to piece together what the filmmakers were thinking and why it just didn't work. And sometimes it's not just what's on screen, The stuff happening around a film's release can have a big impact.
Oh, absolutely. Like, remember the Golden Compass? So much controversy even before it came out.
Oh, yeah.
It got caught up in those religious debates,
Yeah.
which definitely affected how people saw it, even though the film itself wasn't super religious.
Yeah, that's a great point. All that outside stuff can really make or break a movie. It's not always about the film itself.
Right. And you can't forget about how fast visual effects change. Look at the Spiderwick Chronicles. It came out right when CGI was getting big.
Oh, yeah.
Looking back, the effects might look a little dated, but at the time, they were pretty cutting edge.
I guess those early CGI films were like a stepping stone, leading to the amazing visuals we see in fantasy movies now.
Exactly. Makes you wonder what those effects will look like in 10, 20 years. Will they age well, or will they look totally outdated?
That's a whole other deep dive. But for now, let's get back to those moments that made us cringe, laugh, or just shake our heads.
Those what were they thinking moments. We
Hmm.
talked about that earthbending scene in The Last Airbender, but there's another scene from that movie we got to mention. Anang trying to ride that giant wave.
Oh man, that was rough. It looked less like water bending and more like Aang was, I don't know, awkwardly flailing on top of a CGI blob. Did that one get to you too?
Oh, for sure. It felt so out of place, like it belonged in a different movie. No grace, no power, just kind of silly looking.
Okay, let's move on. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The lightning thief. Remember that Medusa scene?
Oh, yeah, with Uma Thurman.
Yeah, the one where she turns everyone to stone. It was trying to be scary, but ended up being more funny than anything. Like a bad haunted house.
The special effects were definitely cheesy. And Uma Thurman's performance, well, let's just say she went all out.
Yeah.
It was hard to take it seriously.
Totally. And sometimes it's not even the effects or the acting, it's the whole vibe of the scene. Like in Inkheart, there's that part where Dustfinger brings a shadow creature to life.
Right.
It's supposed to be this big magical moment, but it falls flat. There's no energy, no creativity.
You can tell they were trying to recreate the magic from the book,
Yeah.
but they just didn't quite get there. They missed that spark.
It's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. Sometimes it works, sometimes you end up with a lot of broken glass.
A good analogy.
Right.
But let's not just focus on the bad stuff. What makes a truly good fantasy adaptation? What are the essential ingredients?
For me, it's all about the world building, the characters, that sense of wonder. I want to be transported to another world, connect with the characters, and experience that same feeling of awe and amazement that got me into fantasy in the first place.
I agree. You need a world that feels real, with characters you care about, and a story that strikes your imagination. And it's about finding that balance, staying true to the original, but also making choices that work on screen.
It's like walking a tightrope between staying true to the original and being original.
Right. And you need to understand both the source material and how movies work.
Yeah.
You can't just copy the book. You have to translate it visually, use the tools of filmmaking to bring the world and characters to life.
Like taking a painting and turning it into music. Different tools, but the goal is the same. Make the audience feel something.
You know, even the best adaptations, they don't please everyone. Some fans will always feel like things were messed up or characters weren't right.
It's true. No adaptation can be perfect. It's always going to be seen through the director's eyes. And that's where it gets interesting. There are lots of ways to adapt something. What one person hates, another person might love.
It all comes down to recognizing that adaptation is subjective. You're taking something from one form and putting it into another. Something is always going to be lost or changed.
But hopefully something is gained too, right? A new perspective, a fresh take, a chance to see the story in a different light.
That's what makes adaptation so exciting. It's about reinventing and rediscovering, pushing the boundaries of storytelling.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, let's talk about some adaptations that took some risks, went in unexpected directions. Some worked, some didn't.
The what-if adaptations.
Yeah.
The ones that make you think, what were they thinking? But also, maybe this could actually work.
Like Stardust, it took this awesome Neil Gaiman novel and turned it into this fun adventure movie. Not exactly like the book, but it still felt like Gaiman, just with its own spin.
A good example of balancing staying true to the original with being original. Took some liberties, but it still respected the book and made something new and entertaining.
Then you've got The Seeker, The Dark is Rising, which tried to squeeze this complex fantasy series into one movie. They tried, but it ended up being a confusing mess.
They tried to do too much, too fast. Crammed a whole saga into 2 hours and lost all the depth and the characters. Like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup.
You get a few drops, but you miss the whole thing.
Exactly. It shows how important pacing is in adaptation. Sometimes it's better to focus on a smaller part of the story instead of trying to do everything.
It's like trying to eat a 5-course meal in one bite. You get a taste, but you don't enjoy it.
Speaking of enjoying things, let's talk about some adaptations that really got it right, that took us to those amazing worlds and made us believe in the impossible.
The ones that felt like stepping right into our favorite books.
Like Howl's Moving Castle. Studio Ghibli took this whimsical book by Diana Wynne Jones and turned it into this beautiful film. It stayed true to the spirit of the book while adding its own magic.
Animation can be perfect for fantasy. It lets you be so creative visually in a way live action just can't.
And it's about getting the right director. Hayao Miyazaki, he gets fantasy. He knows how to create worlds that feel both familiar and fantastical.
It's like he takes those childhood dreams we all have and puts them on screen.
And then there's Pan's Labyrinth, a movie that mixed fantasy and reality in a way that was both beautiful and haunting. It's a darker, more grown-up kind of fantasy, but still magical.
It reminds us that fantasy isn't just about escaping. It can explore serious themes and emotions, too.
And it can make us question what's real and what's not, blurring the line between reality and imagination.
So we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of fantasy adaptation. What have we learned? What can we take away from all this?
Maybe the biggest lesson is that adapting something is hard. You need to understand the story and how movies work. You have to take risks, and you have to be passionate about telling stories. And even then, there's no guarantee it'll work out.
But that's part of what makes it exciting, right? The challenge, the uncertainty, the chance to create something truly special.
Exactly. Adapting something is a journey, not a destination. It's worth taking the risk, even if you don't know where you'll end up.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's appreciate the power of fantasy. It lets us push the limits of our imaginations, face our fears, and believe in the impossible.
And it keeps changing and surprising us, with endless possibilities for stories and new ways of making movies.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to hear from you. What stood out to you during this discussion? What really resonated with you? And what questions are still on your mind? So we've talked about all these things that went wrong, but what really surprised you? Was there one film that just totally missed the mark for you?
It's interesting how often these films just don't get the source material. It's not about copying the plot. It's about understanding what makes the story special. The themes, the tone.
It's like translating a poem. You can get the words right, but sometimes the beauty, the feeling gets lost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why fans get so upset when a movie messes up their favorite book. It's not just about seeing the story on screen. It's about seeing it done right.
Like someone trying to paint a picture of your favorite memory. They get all the details, but the feeling is just not there.
What about you? As a fantasy fan, what's most important to you in an adaptation? Staying true to the book, the special effects, the actors, or something else?
World building, for sure. When a film really takes me to another world, when I can feel the history, the magic, that's when it's special.
And those worlds often need a good mix of practical effects and CGI. The best moments blend them together so well you can't tell where one ends and the other begins.
Like The Lord of the Rings, those huge landscapes were real places, but the creatures were CGI, and it all felt so real.
Exactly. CGI should add to the world, not take over. And sometimes, less is more. A simple practical effect can be way more powerful than a ton of CGI.
It's like good food. Sometimes simple and real is better than a huge buffet of processed stuff.
So one last question. If you could go back and give one piece of advice to the makers of one of these flops, what would it be? What should they have focused on to capture the magic of the original?
And if you could fix one of these movies, which one would you choose? What would you change first?
It's fun to think about how these films could have been better, what we can learn from their mistakes. They remind us how powerful fantasy is and how we should always try to make those magical movie experiences.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into fantasy film flops. We hope you enjoyed it, and we encourage you to keep thinking critically as you explore the world of fantasy.